Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Environmental Law Association Annual Student Conference. My name is John Rantlo, and I'm not alone today. I am with my colleague, Dr. Viljoen. We are both the Northwest representative in the ELA ESCO. So today, we're going to be behind the scenes with Dr. Germarié, and we're just going to make sure that everything is running properly. So at this point, I'm just going to quickly, before we do the official opening and the welcome address, I just quickly want to do the housekeeping rules. First of all, please note that this meeting is being recorded. And secondly, please ensure that your mic is muted. If you are not speaking, please make sure that your mic is muted. And then all the presenters that will be presenting, kindly note that you have been given the right to share your screen. So please just ensure that the only time you would share a screen is when you start to do your presentation. And then as we go on, please feel free to put the questions in the chat box. And at this point, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great honor to invite Prof. Michelle Barnard, who is the Deputy Dean at the Faculty of Law of the Northwest. So Prof. Michelle Barnard has been involved for some time now in the activities of Environmental Law Association, and her research expertise is on energy law and climate change. And she's heavily involved in environmental law program at the Northwest University at the postgraduate level. Dr. Michelle Barnard, I hand over to you to do to officially open this conference.
Thank you, Dr. Rantlo. A question, would you like to have, when someone is presenting, to have their videos on, or should we keep them switched off?
Appreciate seeing your face this morning, Prof.
Not a problem. So, yes, good morning, everyone. Good morning to all participating and presenting students, number one. Welcome also to colleagues from other universities and other guests present this morning. As Dr. Rantlo has indicated, I'm Michelle Barnard. I'm the Deputy Dean at the Faculty of Law at the Northwest University. And it gives me great pleasure to, on behalf of our Executive Dean, Dr. Neo Murray, who could unfortunately not attend this morning, on behalf of the faculty as well as the university, to welcome everyone to this, a virtual welcome to everyone who is attending this conference hosted by ELA. I've taken a look at the program for the next 2 days, and I must say that I'm very interested as an environmental law scholar myself and as an ELA member to see all the very interesting presentations and discussions that will be awaiting us for the next 2 days. I want you to thank every participant for engaging with their topic of celebrating 25 years of Section 24 of the Constitution. And finally, I would also like to extend a special thank you to the coordinators that you see on the screen today, Dr. Germarié, Viljoen, and Dr. John Rantlo. I've been watching them running around this morning, getting everything ready for the conference. And I must say that they have done a spectacular job in putting together a program that's going to induce a lot of interesting discussion among the scholars. So from my side, welcome to everyone, and I therefore now declare this conference open.
Thank you so much, Prof. Michelle, and thank you so much for always supporting us in our activities. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point, I am going to invite our President, Advocate Peter Kantor, to do the official welcoming for this conference. Advocate Peter, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you very much, John Germarié, and for the promotion to President. I'm actually the chair, but President I'll take. Thank you. I've been asked to set the scene for celebrating 25 years of the 1996 right to environment. Setting the scene to consider our theme invites us to have a look at the bigger picture of the last 25 years and where we are at the moment. There was much to celebrate in those heady days of 1996 when the final constitution was assented to. To those who had endured the struggle against apartheid regime and witnessed the birth of our democracy and the country's hopeful vision of itself, it seemed that the sky was the limit for our jurisprudence. The precursor to our environmental right in Section 24 was Section 29 of the interim constitution of 1993, which will sound very familiar to all of you. It was one sentence long. Every person shall have a right to an environment which is not detrimental to his or her health or well-being. This had whet the appetite, and we started to imagine what this could lead to. The 1996 formulation did not disappoint, and we eagerly awaited the legislation that would give intergenerational justice, conservation, pollution control, and sustainable development. In the decade that followed, we welcomed important legislative milestones along the way, also well known to all of you. In 1998, of course, we had NEMA and the National Water Act. 1999, we had the World Heritage Convention Act and the National Heritage Resources Act. 2003, the Protected Areas Act. 2004, the Biodiversity Act and the Air Quality Act. And in 2008, the Coastal Management Act. In the meanwhile, the developing jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court delivered its own milestone cases, such as Grootboom in 2000, which showed that socioeconomic rights that are set out in the Constitution are indeed vital to the enjoyment of all the other human rights, including the environmental right. Beto Star in 2004, which was about the allocation of fishing quotas, and clarified the basis of legal review and showed its importance to environmental rights, as we have seen. These and other cases paved the way for the landmark judgment of the Constitutional Court in Fuel Retailers in 2007, which gave full legal import to the notion of sustainable development. Our law has continued to develop since then, but I am now going to zoom out and consider for a moment the bigger picture. Well, 25 years is a landmark anniversary, and anniversaries are something we celebrate. In 2021, the atmosphere is not so much one of celebration as one of deep concern. The climate change emergency has imposed itself on our agenda, and even for South Africa, with its litany of woes, this is true. If only the world had realized the nature of this emergency 25 years ago, our aims and our milestones could have been different. We thought sustainable development meant business as usual for the engines of growth, for greenhouse gas emissions in particular. We were wrong, and our aims missed the mark. The writing was on the wall about climate change, and we did not heed it. The Brundtland report on our common future, and indeed for sustainable development, came out in 1987, and the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997. In the future, we probably will not have such advanced warning about severe threats. Things are changing more and more quickly. But it's never too late to reset our aims. In some ways, the COVID-19 pandemic has facilitated this by shaking up our expectations of what is normal and what is possible. In this respect, perhaps the recent IPCC report on climate change and COP26 come at an opportune time. Our Constitution has given us tools that can help us do this. To be clear, we need more than law to save us. We need a new story as a society. Perhaps one is already emerging, the story of green energy, an equitable, nature-positive, a net zero world where economic growth and social development can be truly sustainable and well-being is valued more highly. We need signs of hope that we can cling to. Let us not forget that when our government institutions were under capture, one of the few that resisted capture was the judiciary. The courts held firmly to the rule of law. Upon this rock, we need to be able to build our story. We need ordinary people to feel it is our constitution, it's our justice, our courts, our society, our environment, our common good. We need a voice of hope. We want to be able to hold on to a vision of a just society. Perhaps a good 21st century project will be something like to change our environment to be more conducive to human happiness rather than to treat the ills that our current value systems have produced. Globally, the law is starting to respond to civil society, including our youth, pressing for action to protect their future. Witness, for example, the Urgenda, Juliana, Shell, and the Arthur cases, and thousands more reportedly in the pipeline. We are indeed looking for new ways to respond. New stories start to tell themselves, like the Me Too movement, the Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, Just Transition. Our aims will be adjusted according to the emerging new story. By the time we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the 1996 environmental right in 2046, we want to be in a world that has successfully averted the climate change disaster, that has made a just transition to a nature positive and net zero society, one that truly natures the biosphere, one that meets the new challenges that threaten our well-being. In short, we need to adapt our aims and to be ready to keep adapting them as change speeds up and new threats emerge. As lawyers, we need constantly to keep an eye on the bigger picture. I hope this sets the scene for us. I want to thank each and every one of our student presenters for grappling with the issues they are speaking to and for going the extra mile to present at the ELA Student Conference. We all very much look forward to your presentations and to the discussions. Lastly, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Juta for being our conference sponsor, and to the generous donors. It's my pleasure to add my welcome to you all, to hand over to our session chairs. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Advocate Peter, our ELA chair. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Dr. Germarié, to do her part before we jump into the first session.
Thank you. Yes, from my side also for the introductions, Peter and Prof. Barnard. Thank you so much for that. From my side, just the following. All of the student presenters are going to be assessed. We've got great prizes for the best prize for the best presenter. Yeah, just a heads up for all the presenters. We've got a panel assessing, and yeah, tomorrow evening we will be awarding prizes for the best presentation. For those of you that will be partaking that, we will assess the content of your presentation as well as the structure thereof, whether it's logical and easy to follow. We will even have a look at the display of your PowerPoint presentation, the use of your visual aids, also your delivery, how your clarity, your audibility, etc., and also how you respond to questions. So that is just for you guys to keep in mind when preparing for your presentations, and we are looking forward to them. We've got approximately 10 minutes before the first session starts. So we would like to invite you to quickly grab a cup of coffee or engage in the chat room, and then we will start at 11 sharp. Thank you.
together with Germarié, Viljoen. It's 11 o'clock or just gone 11 o'clock. The format of the session will be, we will let the speakers do their talks, and then we'll leave discussion and questions and answers till the end of the session. So if you have anything that you want to ask the speakers, just write it down and you'll have an opportunity to do so once all of the speakers have spoken. So the format is the students have 15 minutes each to speak, and then we'll have questions and answers after that. So let me just open the program. Our first speaker this morning is Melandri Steenkamp, who's an LLD candidate at the South African Research Chair for Cities, Law and Environmental Sustainability, or CLES, at Northwest University. And her paper is called A Legal Analysis of Water Management Approaches for Achieving Urban Water Security in South Africa. So Melandri, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Prof. Michael Kidd. It is an honor to be here today, and as the title of my presentation suggests, I will be looking at a legal analysis of water management approaches for achieving urban water security. And I just wanted to introduce myself, show my face to you. I will be switching off my video for the duration of my presentation. So thank you all, and I hope that you find it interesting or at least a little bit enlightening. Thank you. Trying to find my clicker, I'm sorry. Okay, so this, as you can see on the slides, that this is the structure that my presentation will be following. I will be looking into the conceptual framings of water security, and then specifically looking at water governance and water management and how the South African legal regime addresses that specifically, and then looking into the observations from municipalities, and specifically the case of Cape Town, and then reflecting on ways forward with regards to water governance and water management for urban water security. Now to sketch the background of this presentation, I think the water security context, or the water context in South Africa, is generally very complex. We sit with rapidly growing and an urbanizing population, which means an increased water requirement for socioeconomic growth. And this rapid urbanization further complicates the situation as it affects many resources and components of the environment in urban areas and beyond. So the result here is that there continues to be an increasing demand for all resources, including for water. And it is also estimated that South Africa has lost over 50% of its wetlands. And of the remaining 3.2 million hectares, less than 5% of South Africa's land cover, 48% are critically endangered. And a third of these wetlands are already in poor conditions. And we all are aware and familiar with the fact that South Africa is a water scarce country, but we continue to see this valuable resource lost down rivers and streams and into our oceans. And this is further exacerbated by increasing impacts of climate change on water resources, leading to increasing occurrences of flooding and of droughts in most of South Africa's urban areas. And this is also compounded by the fact that we're faced with issues such as corruption, infrastructural challenges, as well as fragmented governance, poor planning, and accountability concerns. So against this background, water affects and is affected by a wide variety of different sectors. This has led to looking at water issues from the perspective of an integrated or holistic theoretical framework, at least. This has led to the concept of water security. Now, water, as I've just mentioned, plays a central role in connecting various critical and interrelated global issues relating from land, energy, economic growth, climate, environment, and food. And in this increasingly urbanized world, cities and their surrounding areas are becoming more interconnected, thus affecting the water cycle and overall human security. However, cities have also become integral in addressing environmental and security issues. So this has led in the rise of the term or the use of the term water security, as I've mentioned, over the past 2 decades, specifically following from 2007 until 2013. And the term was originally used in policy circles deriving from the World Water Forum in Hague, then providing the definition of water security, or specifically referring to water security. But in the context of this presentation, I look at specifically urban water security. And urban water security, you can see the definition here on the slides. I will not read it, but it essentially includes aspects such as access to water, water for socioeconomic development, safeguarding the protection of water against waterborne pollution and climate-related water disasters, as well as for preserving aquatic ecosystems. And this is all incredibly reliant on a good governance and accountability framework that is reliant on the considerations of the interests of all stakeholders through effective legal regimes that are transparent, participatory, and accountable, and that are properly planned, operated, and the infrastructure maintained, as well as development of capacity. So these are some of the dimensions of water security based on this definition that I've identified. And you see the first one here, which is ensuring access to water, which essentially relates to the human right to water as we understand it, and its sub-elements of water quality, accessibility, water quantity, etc. And then the second dimension, which is the protection of aquatic urban ecosystems, which essentially refers to our understanding of protecting the environment at large. And then also protection against water-related disasters and climate change, thus referring to disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management, and then ensuring the sustainable use of water for socioeconomic activities. So we see that the use of water security essentially refers to all the dimensions of sustainability, looking at the social aspects of water, looking at the economic as well as the environmental aspects of water. So now to govern this, or to address the complexity surrounding water security, we need good water governance. Now, water governance specifically refers to the mechanisms that we use, that water services used to provide, water management institutions used to provide to users, and implies the organizational structures, the relationships, the norms, and also the stakeholders that are involved in water services through independent urban water systems, for example. So essentially, good water governance would rely on clear policies, coherent laws, strong institutions, and enforcement mechanisms. And the implementation of water governance would be through law policies, through vision, as well as through institutions. And it's important to note that building water governance capacities is an ongoing process, which involves decision-making surrounding water resource development, as well as water management specifically. So how do we achieve effective water governance? So what the scholarship describes various ways of addressing water governance. There have also been different approaches that have arisen out of the concepts of good governance. And these include, for example, principles such as open and transparent institutions, inclusive and communicative institutions that refer to participation in the water policy context, coherent and integrative water policies and actions, as well as equitable and ethical with regards to water interest groups, stakeholders, and consumers, as well as referring to performance and operations specifically. And this is where we get accountability and efficiency, as well as responsiveness and sustainability coming in. Now, something that has been recognized as an important aspect of water governance is flexibility. And here you can see the last section on the slide, which refers to something that comes from the white paper, already showed that we need flexibility to address different situations. And with issues such as climate change, which are dynamic and not stationary, we need a governance system that is adaptable to changing circumstances. So now getting to specifically water management. So water management refers to the activities of analyzing and monitoring water resources, as well as developing and implementing measures to keep the state of a water resource within which has been negotiated as the desirable bounds. So this specific water management would be the implementation, to put it bluntly, of the principles that have been outlined in the water governance framework. So the water governance is something that is throughout, from the beginning to the implementation phase. But water management would specifically refer to how we address the desired outcome, or how we want to achieve the desired outcome. And here, the management of the environment. So this is where the environment comes into the water security context. And the management this has been described as encompassing the preservation of the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, as well as ecologically sustainable development, which is incredibly important when we refer to the Section 24 environmental right in the South African Constitution. As well as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. And this is where that sustainability or sustainable development context comes in. And then the last aspect, which refers to our understanding of the environment in terms of NEMA. Okay, before we get to the integrated water planning solutions, I think it's important to mention back, looking at the background in the complexity of the current state of our water resources, or water security specifically. We are aware of the fact that the Anthropocene is changing the global water system, but it is also simultaneously challenging conventional water management approaches. Hence, these new conditions of the Anthropocene require us to look at the impacts on water through a shifting of approaches. So to more integrated, adaptive, coordinated, and participatory solutions in order to address these complex issues that face water security. So there are many different water management approaches that are identified in addressing water security. These include the integrated planning solutions on the slide, IWRM, IUWM, and water sensitive urban design or water sensitive urban management. And many other approaches that have also been adopted in South Africa and globally include water conservation and water demand management, includes, for example, adaptive water management, resilient water management, and many others. But I want to just focus on specifically the integrated planning management of water. Okay. So integrated water resource management is perhaps the most accepted or most well-defined form of water resource management. It's also perhaps the longest existing, coming from, for example, the 90s in the International Conference on Water and the Environment. And the Dublin statement laid the foundation for guiding integrated management of water, of the world's water resources. And it identified these 4 principles, which I will also not be reading through, but you can see it specifically refers to the management and safeguarding of water. And it also refers to a participatory approach that involves users, planners, and policymakers at all levels. Now, IWRM is defined as a process that promotes the management and coordinated development of water, land, and related resources to maximize the subsequent social and economic welfare equitably without compromising the sustainability of important ecosystems. Hence, the principles that are identified from this include equity, environmental sustainability, as well as efficiency. And IWRM has been mainstream through a lot of the international instruments, as well as in our national legal framework. The Millennium Development Goals refer to IWRM, the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation refers to IWRM, as well as the Sustainable Development Goal 6, which specifically contains a component of integrated water resource management. Okay. So these are some of the pillars of integrated water resource management you can see arising from those 3: economic efficiency, equity, and environmental sustainability. And how we can achieve these principles is through management instruments, through enabling environment, an institutional framework which consists of your national, in the South African context, your national, your provincial, your local, as well as all other stakeholders that may have an interest in water resources. So this is to achieve a balance, so water for livelihood and water as a resource. And this is kind of led to this dominant approach to looking at water security from a two-dimensional lens, only as protection of ecosystems and protection of access to resources or for socioeconomic development, but completely disregarding the other aspects of water and water's integratedness in many other sectors. So the second...
Sorry, will you please start to conclude?
Okay. Thank you. So IWRM refers to planning and operation of the urban water management, and this is almost the enactment of the IWRM principles, but on an urban scale. Now, water-sensitive urban design is a new and emerging paradigm that refers to mitigating water scarcity by and protecting ecosystems through the development of water-sensitive urban areas. So this water-sensitive urban areas, or this water-sensitive urban design, specifically refers to making cities more resilient, sustainable, and productive. And here you can see a little breakdown of the specific definition or the management approach. And this is what I want to get to. This is where we used to be water supply city, where the focus was specifically on supplying water, making sure that everyone has access to water. And while this has largely been achieved, we still do have, there's still significant progress to be made. But then we need to start thinking about the sewered city, which refers to public health protection in the city, and then the flood protection in the city. So these essentially refer to all of the dimensions of urban water security. Which ultimately we want to achieve a water-sensitive city where we have adaptive multifunctional infrastructure and urban design reinforcing water-sensitive behaviors, as well as intergenerational equity, resilience to climate change, etc. So as I will not be having enough time to get through everything, I want to just quickly show an important aspect arising from the city of Cape Town. So this is a list of all of the instruments of the city of Cape Town, and these are important when we look at achieving water-sensitive cities. And this is just an outline of the amount of times the city has referred to water-sensitive city or achieving water-sensitive cities in various of its policies. You can see the number of times it has referred to water-sensitive cities in its Water Strategies 26, which is quite significant, as this is perhaps the most dominant and most significant strategy in the city addressing its various water-related issues. So I will be concluding with that. If there's any questions on anything, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melandri. Let me just find my program again. So just to repeat what I said earlier, we'll deal with questions and comments at the end once all the speakers have had their opportunity. So our second speaker then from the University of Pretoria, who's an LLM candidate, is Adelaide Chagopa, and she is going to be talking about toilets, reconceptualizing the right to sanitation in South Africa.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adelaide. I'm from the University of Pretoria. Just wanted to show you my face before we begin the presentation, and I hope you find it interesting. Thank you. Before I start my presentation, I would like to share an encounter I had with you. In Devlin, in Johannesburg, there is a waste dumping site. Living in this dumping site is the Housekeeping community. Whilst there, I naively asked a resident about the status of their toilet facilities. She stared at me, then gestured around her and said, "We go wherever there's space." They were practicing open defecation. Ordinarily, in you and I's lives, sanitation is not a subject of great thought. When you need a toilet, you know where to find it, you know it will be reasonably clean, and you know that it will be operational. This is a privilege that millions of people do not have. So for today, let's talk about toilets. Sanitation is one of the basic necessities. Oh, sorry. Sorry, there seems to be narration in my presentation. I would just like to fix that if you don't mind. Just want to remove that. So can someone just help me with the technicalities? I don't know how to remove the narration. Okay. All right, sorry about that, everyone. Just some technical difficulties. Okay. Sanitation is one of the basic necessities which contributes to human dignity and quality of life, and is an essential prerequisite for success in the fight against poverty, hunger, child deaths, gender inequality, and empowerment. Defining sanitation is not an easy task. This is because it's an amalgamation of different elements and involves both a place for individuals to urinate, defecate, and practice menstrual hygiene, as well as the system for the management of that waste. I find that Langford's definition of sanitation correctly encapsulates all these aspects, as well as the broader human rights concerns around it. And so he defines it as the ability to effectively access space and facilities that afford privacy, dignity, and safety in which to urinate, defecate, and practice related hygiene in a culturally acceptable manner, and by virtue of their design, management, and accompanying services, protect the user, the locality, and the wider population from the adverse consequences of contamination. This is quite an expansive definition, but before the discussion around sanitation goes any further, I think it's important to situate it within the legal framework. Internationally, sanitation has been addressed in the context of various other rights, including but not limited to housing, health, privacy, dignity, as well as the rights of vulnerable groups such as women, children, and prisoners. It's also been closely linked to water. However, sanitation gives rights to very specific and complex issues that a link to water can obscure. Additionally, water and sanitation are not necessarily related in terms of concerns. Water concerns are not necessarily sanitation concerns. In 2015, sanitation was recognized as an independent right, which is an essential component of the right to an adequate standard of living as expressed in the ICE-SCR. And so the explicit recognition of the right to sanitation gives rights to obligations for states to immediately satisfy the minimum levels of the right to sanitation and use the maximum resources to progressively achieve the full realization. In the ACHPR, there is no explicit recognition, but there is implicit recognition, as well as recognition within various other documents, including the principles and guidelines on the implementation of economic, social, and cultural rights. So it's clear that the ICE-SCR and the ACHPR establish a right to sanitation. South Africa has ratified both these instruments and is so bound by obligations stemming from them. In South Africa, the right to sanitation can be inferred from the Constitution, namely Section 24, the right to a healthy environment, as well as Section 26, the right of access to adequate housing, which was then confirmed in Grootboom, and Section 27(1)(b), where waterborne sanitation is concerned. Beyond the Constitution, Section 2 of the Water Services Act provides for the right of access to basic water and basic sanitation, where basic sanitation is defined as the prescribed minimum standard for services necessary for the safe, hygienic, and adequate collection, removal, disposal, or purification of human excreta, domestic wastewater, sewage from households, and importantly, informal households. Regulation 2 then goes on further to prescribe the minimum standards for basic sanitation services. And this is where the majority of the reconceptualization I will do will occur. Interestingly, the Water Services Act does not draw a distinction between water and sanitation. They're collectively described as water services. And so legislatively, water services authorities are responsible for the provision of water and sanitation. But institutionally, on a national level, sanitation was moved from DWS to GHS, which has resulted in some institutional incoherence around sanitation provision. But because of DHS's involvement, the Housing Act then also plays a significant role in the right to sanitation. Also relevant is the Municipal Systems Act. In the interest of time, I'm not going to discuss the entire legislative framework, but I have listed the relevant provisions and policies here. Importantly is the Free Basic Sanitation Implementation Strategy, which recognizes a right to sanitation and makes some provision for poor households to access sanitation. Unfortunately, it fails to also quantify what the right to sanitation is made of and excuses this omission by asserting the complexities of sanitation and its very context-specific nature. And so maximum discretion is given to municipalities to determine the nature and supply of sanitation. Clearly, there is an established basic right to sanitation in South Africa. Despite the constitutional and statutory provisions, though, the right is neither universally nor equitably enjoyed, although statistics show that on a macro level, there are improvements in access, as you can see in the figure on the left. At district and local level, access is worryingly low, and there are disproportionate levels of access between and within municipalities. In particular, people living in poverty and in informal settlements are largely excluded from the benefits of access to adequate sanitation and also face discrimination as well as a range of other barriers to access. For example, informal settlements are not included in urban planning, and municipalities are often reluctant to provide formal services for fear of formalizing their informal settlements. Additionally, although the statistics do show improvement on a macro level, they do not account for the quality of the provisioned sanitation facilities. And there are incidences of high failure rates, which naturally prejudice the enjoyment of the sanitation facility. And so the right to sanitation is not adequately fulfilled. In actuality, a dizzying number of South Africans suffer indignity born from a lack of adequate sanitation. These deficiencies in access are not only reflective of apartheid's systemic and structural patterns of discrimination and marginalization, but are also emblematic of several issues in sanitation, including continued spatial injustice, the fragmented and incoherent institutional framework, service refurbishment and extension backlogs, inadequate maintenance and monitoring of existing infrastructure. And we're seeing these issues come up more, especially in areas like Hammanskraal, the monitoring of service delivery projects and inadequate sanitation, education, and awareness programs. So to combat these disparities in access and to help move the right to adequate and equitable access to sanitation forward, I argue that a freestanding substantive right to sanitation should be formulated using minimum core obligations. Consequently, the progressive realization of the right to adequate access to sanitation will be concerned with the improvement, the continuous improvement of the nature and quality of access, thus moving beyond the minimum levels of the right to sanitation. So minimum core obligations refer to the entitlements of the minimum non-negotiable threshold of socioeconomic and cultural rights, below which the fulfillment of the rights cannot fall, as well as the minimum non-negotiable levels of the right that people are entitled to. And this is very important. They ensure that the most vulnerable members of society aren't left behind in the pursuit for full realization, which can obviously take a lot of time. DWS in its policy documents continuously and very aptly refers to provision as some for all rather than all for some. Unfortunately, that's not something we experience in reality. And so the starting point of my reconceptualization of the minimum core of sanitation is going to be extending the prescribed minimum standards in Regulation 2 using the Quad AQ model, which is availability, accessibility, affordability, acceptability, quality, and hygiene. By expanding this, I hope that we can bridge the gap in access by quantifying what a minimum level of sanitation should be. Availability means that sanitation facilities should be available within each household as well as in its immediate vicinity. The sanitation framework doesn't really define what immediate vicinity would be, but I propose that it should be within at least 300 meters of a household to ensure that women, children, and other vulnerable people do not have to travel far to have access to sanitation services. Additionally, the facility itself should at the very least be a VIP or any other sort of improved sanitation service per Regulation 2, which is also acceptable based on context. In South Africa, it is not sustainable to have traditional flush toilets established now, nor is it really sustainable to have a single pit where deep excavation is impossible. Thus, ventilated double pits would be more appropriate, or perhaps composting toilets. Accessibility also means that the facility should be accessible to everyone and should account for use by people with special needs. That means that perhaps the facility's floor should be level to enable wheelchair access, the doors wide, perhaps the provision of handrails, and should also minimize the risk to physical security. That means, unlike in the better case, toilets should be fully secured and should have a door and be enclosed. Affordability is the next important point. The price of sanitation services must be affordable for everyone and should include a reasonable charge for the maintenance, treatment, and disposal of fecal sludge, especially for on-site solutions like VIPs. The ongoing cost of such maintenance and operation should also be considered in the sanitation infrastructure planning, and the municipal budgets should also account for it. In the rollout of VIPs, we have seen that municipalities failed to account for the ongoing operation and maintenance of them. And so they are disturbingly referred to as full-ups because they are quite literally full of fecal sludge, and municipalities fail to empty them or treat them timeously, which is a violation of the right to adequate sanitation, amongst other rights. Acceptability then refers to the fact that the sanitation facility should be culturally and socially acceptable. In the rush to provide toilets, there is always a discrepancy between what is actually acceptable and what has been provisioned. We see often that the technology chosen is not necessarily acceptable for the community, or it violates some part of their culture. And so that sanitation facility is not utilized, and people then usually refer back to unacceptable methods like bucket system or even open defecation. Quality of sanitation services refers to the fact that the facilities should be sustainable and should be built according to technical specifications to avoid failures. On-site municipal sanitation facilities should have maintenance and treatment plans that also include hygiene education to ensure that users are empowered to manage and maintain their facilities to promote hygiene and health. I've obviously not fully discussed the entirety of the normative content of the right to sanitation, but I believe that based on the criteria I've mentioned, it's possible to quantify what the core content of sanitation would be. That is the adequate and acceptable levels of sanitation, which should mean affordable, safe, sufficient quality and assurance of supply, where the minimum acceptable level is an improved sanitation facility, at the very least a VIP or an equivalent technology, within the vicinity of a household with effective maintenance, treatment, and disposal plans, and that such a facility should also be accompanied by appropriate hand washing facilities, as well as appropriate health and hygiene awareness and education for communities. Ultimately, sanitation is very complex and requires a lot of flexibility, and that's why there has been a reluctance to quantify what sanitation is made of. But I believe that quantifying some aspects of the right to sanitation would help establish a standard that should be achieved in the pursuit of full realization. This should optimistically help bridge the gaps in access, particularly for people who've been left behind or live in limbo whilst the upgrading of informal settlements plans get approved, or people who've been relegated to long-term use of emergency sanitation services like chemical toilets, as well as people who simply have no access at all, of which there are many. Additionally, setting a quantifiable standard should help to facilitate the development of South African jurisprudence on the right to sanitation in a manner that is consistent with international norms and standards, and also has the potential to give greater meaning to the right of sanitation, as well as empower and uphold the dignity of people who need it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adelaide. Going back to my program, our third speaker for the first session, another student from CLES at Northwest University, this time a master's student, Meeschka Diedericks, and the title of her paper is Disaster Risk Management Law as a Measure to Reduce the Risks of Communicable and Vector-borne Diseases in South African Cities.
Okay, good day, everyone. I am Meeschka Diedericks. I just wanted to introduce myself, and then I will be screen sharing without my video from here on out. Okay, so the theme of my presentation is disaster risk management law as a measure to reduce the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases in South African cities. In this presentation, we will be covering communicable and vector-borne diseases as a public health risk in cities, the legally relevant nexus between urbanization, communicable and vector-borne diseases, and then the legislative framework for disaster risk management in South Africa. So communicable and vector-borne diseases has been a long-standing public health concern and public health threat to populations around the world. So in 2019, we've seen that infectious diseases accounted for approximately 18% of all global deaths. And then when we look at the top 10 leading causes of death, we see that lower respiratory tract infections are the most deadly communicable disease, followed by diarrheal diseases at number 8. And then when we zoom in on low-income countries, we see that people in low-income countries are more likely to die from communicable diseases than non-communicable diseases, since most of these top 10 causes of death consist of communicable diseases. And then there are also various factors which could contribute to the transmission or the risks of communicable diseases, such as the globalization of trade and travel, environmental challenges such as climate change, and then population movements. But with the outbreak of the coronavirus, we've seen that cities are very vulnerable to the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases, since cities often act as epicenters for the transmission of the virus, and densely populated areas often increase the transmission of this virus, especially those transmitted through the facial oral route. Then other factors contributing to the transmission of communicable and vector-borne diseases is inadequate housing, water, waste, and sanitation management. Then when we look at South African cities, we see that South Africa is also particularly vulnerable to the transmission or risks of communicable diseases, since the leading cause of death in 2018 is tuberculosis, which is a communicable disease, which is then followed by human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV and AIDS, then influenza and pneumonia, and chronic lower respiratory diseases. So there are also several factors which contribute to the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases in South Africa specifically. This is like the growing number of informal settlements in urban areas, the lack of basic services to these growing number of urban residents, then poor urban planning, and also the slow spatial transformation in South African cities. So the legally relevant nexus between urbanization, communicable, and vector-borne diseases is that everyone has the right to an environment that is not harmful to their health and well-being. And this right places an enforceable and positive duty on local government in particular to take legislative, reasonable, and other measures in order to secure an environment that is safe and healthy to everyone. So this obligation or this duty to secure this healthy environment often falls on environmental health practitioners while carrying out the municipal health services function as allocated to local government in terms of Schedule 4B of the Constitution. This municipal health services function includes the surveillance of communicable diseases and vector control. And then Section 32 of the National Health Act basically states that municipalities must provide these services efficiently and effectively to everyone within their municipal area of jurisdiction. However, when we look at South Africa's rapid urban population growth, which is expected to increase from 60% of people to 71% and 80% of people living in urban areas by 2030 and 2050 respectively, we see that this rapid urban population growth often creates challenges for municipalities in one, delivering this municipal health services, and also the delivery of basic municipal services, which could significantly reduce the prevalence of communicable and vector-borne diseases in our cities. So therefore, it is necessary to look at other measures outside of the traditional health sector, which could help us aid or reduce and mitigate the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases in South African cities. So South Africa has a very well-developed disaster risk management law and policy framework in place. Now, this consists of a generic disaster management legislation such as the Disaster Management Act, the National Disaster Management Framework, and the Disaster Management Volunteer Regulations. And it also consists of legislation dealing with specific types of disasters, such as the Fire Brigade Services Act, and then sector-specific legislation such as the NEMA. Well, for purposes of this presentation, I won't be going into all of these types of legislations for disaster risk management, but the focus will be mainly towards the Disaster Management Act, the National Disaster Management Framework, and then the Disaster Management Plans. So the Disaster Management Act is the framework legislation or part of the generic legislation which regulates all aspects of disaster management in South Africa. Now, the Disaster Management Act basically regulates disaster management through comprehensive institutional frameworks, policy mandates, procedures for classifying and managing disasters, and then also for funding in order to address rehabilitation and recovery measures. Now, when we look at the screen, we see that this is how the Disaster Risk Management Act basically regulates disaster management at a local level. So on local level, for the institutional frameworks, we have municipal disaster management centers and advisory firms in terms of Section 43 and 51 of the Act. And then the municipal disaster management centers must then specialize in issues of disaster risk and disaster management within areas of their jurisdiction. They must provide information regarding some of the disasters, and then also have to make provisions for contingency plans and strategies in order to reduce the risks of disasters. In the policy development and strategic planning framework for disaster management, in the Act, it provides for municipal disaster management frameworks and then municipal disaster management plans. So the municipal disaster management framework must be established by each and every metropolitan and district municipality, and then it must comply with the Disaster Management Act, the National Disaster Management Framework, and the relevant provincial disaster management framework of each metropolitan municipality. Then the municipal disaster management plans are provided for in sections 52 and 53 of the Disaster Management Act, and this Act basically provides very specific requirements for the management or development of disaster management plans, and this plan must form an integral part of the integrated development plan. However, I will revert back to the contents and development of this plan in the next slide. And then for the classification and declaration of disasters, we have Section 23, which actually takes place at national level through the National Disaster Management Center. And then we have Section 55 which is the declaration of a local state of disaster, which basically sets out local government's primary responsibilities in coordinating and managing a local state of disasters, such as the issuing of bylaws or setting up of plans related to the resources available within the municipality and the various employees necessary for emergency services. Then we have the post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation in sections 56 and 57 of the Disaster Management Act, which basically provides guidelines for funding post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation, and also expands on the national contributions to alleviate the effects of local and provincial disasters. So the local disaster risk management plans, as stated in the previous slide, is basically provided for in sections 52 and 53 of the Disaster Risk Management Act. Now, this act provides very specific provisions, which could be seen here on the slide. It basically provides for things such as disaster risk assessments, and then contingency plans, and then institutional frameworks related to disaster management within this act. I won't be reading all of these things, so you can just see them over there. And then, what's also supposed to be said here is that although the Disaster Management Act basically sets out very specific provisions for the development and implementation of disaster management plans, there is also the idea that cities or municipalities have different disaster risk management planning capacities. So in order to counter or aid this, the National Disaster Management Framework makes space for 3 levels of disaster management plans, which is a level 1 plan basically only includes institutional arrangements for disaster management, contingency plans or threats, and then identifying key stakeholders for the development of a level 2 plan. And then level 2 includes disaster arrangements and contingency plans, comprehensive disaster risk assessments, and then mechanisms for establishing disaster risk reduction projects. And then level 3 looks at the institutional arrangements and supportive capacities. It looks at aligning disaster management planning with other government initiatives, and also informed disaster risk assessment and ongoing monitoring capabilities. So this distinction between the 3 plans or levels of plans is important because it sort of influences or dictates the amounts of information that I was able to gather from these plans when considering some of these strategies or procedures that municipalities use in order to reduce the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases. The inclusion of these plans in my research would enable me to see to what extent the South African municipalities provide for or provides for the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases in South African cities, and also to see what measures they deployed in order to reduce these risks. So then when we look at the South African disaster risk management plans of the 8 metropolitan municipalities, on this slide we see the first 4 of the 8 metropolitan municipalities. But I should also, before we go into that, I should also say that my research is still ongoing. I'm not complete with it yet. I'm still at the beginning stages of my LLM dissertation. So this slide does not yet include some of the contingency plans or institutional frameworks or early warning systems which could be used by municipalities in order to reduce the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases. But what this slide or what this table does include is some of the risks which each municipality identified are related to communicable and vector-borne diseases within the municipal area, and then some of the disaster risk management or disaster risk reduction measures within these areas. So as we can see from the slide, most of these municipalities do have some strategy or measure in place, except for the city of Ekurhuleni, who didn't really state any clear measures in order to reduce the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases. And then here we have the last 4 of the South Africa's 8 metropolitan municipalities, in which they also identified their communicable vector-borne disease risks within their areas and the various measures which they've employed. So this includes like a public strategy for COVID-19 and preparedness plans, or vulnerability indicators for the transmission of communicable and vector-borne diseases. So then, okay, so then when we get to the conclusion or some of these summaries, we've seen that South Africa has a very comprehensive disaster risk management law and policy framework, but it does not really provide for or specific measures in order to reduce the risks of communicable or vector-borne diseases. It more broadly refers to how to manage disaster risk management at all types of levels, including including local government. But what we know is that we can, that this act also applies to any type of disaster, including the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases. So when we look at the institutional measures, we can apply this to disaster risk management, for instance, by making sure that that municipal disaster management centers or advisory firms actually also specialize in issues of communicable and vector-borne disease risks, that they provide information regarding these risks, and that they organize and facilitate activities in order to reduce or mitigate the risks of these things. Then for the policy or procedural mandates, we can see that these procedures or policies does include the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases, and that there is strategies involved in order to reduce the risk. Then for classifying and managing disasters, we can ensure that municipalities actually effectively and efficiently look at the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases in order to identify it, and then to hopefully counter and mitigate some of the risks before we actually get to the rehabilitation and recovery of these things. And then, so although there is different types of disaster risk management plans, the 3 levels of different plans that we've differentiated it against, differentiated between, it can also be seen that with this research, I hope to find that the disaster risk management plans could be more effectively utilized in order to indicate some of the procedures and strategies in order to deal with the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases, and also some of the institutional measures and contingency plans in order to reduce the risks of communicable and vector-borne diseases during a specific outbreak. So yeah, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I thank you for listening, and then I would love to engage with you in the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Meeschka. Which now brings us to the 4th and final speaker for this particular session, also from CLES. She's a PhD candidate, Rantlo. I hope it's a she. The title of this presentation is The Constitutional Environmental Right of Street Traders in the Anthropocene.
Thank you very much, Prof. Kidd. It's a she, yes. My name is Rantlo. Like everybody else, what I will do is just share my screen just for 2 seconds, just so that people know who I am, and I will follow suit to like how everybody else has done it. So if I can just quickly then share my slides. I'm not sure if they are in presentation mode. There we go. I think now I am. I am very privileged to be speaking after the 3 speakers that we've had, interesting presentations that we've given, and they've genuinely given context to what I am going to be speaking about, or at least what they have managed to do, is allow me now to take a human-centered approach to all of what they've spoken to, the issue of sanitation, the issue of water, as well as transmissible diseases and viruses that we have. I focus specifically on the constitutional environmental right of street traders, and I phrase this in the context of the Anthropocene, because this is what, for me, speaks to a people-centered approach. What I will do is I'll quickly give an outline. I'll have an argument and a premise on which I base my argument. Therefore, I'll need to give 2 definitions, and they're important because this is where I place the street trading sector particularly. Then I'll give a description of it, at least in trying to paint a picture of what the street trading sector looks like, especially in South Africa. Then I look at the constitutional environmental rights that our street traders have. before I conclude. My argument today is that in adopting an anthropocentric approach to the constitutional environmental right of street traders, we can start to see a change in municipal reactions to the street trading sector, where we are trying to harmonize the relationship that our local government in particular has with the street trading sector in South Africa. So what do I base this argument on? The Anthropocene for me speaks to everything people-centered. For me, what I've seen in studying, or at least when I am researching on the Anthropocene, is that several scholars are speaking about how humans themselves have managed to change the ecosystems as we know them. And what has happened in the past or the previous 50 years is that the human history has been changed by our own behavior. Many of the changes, therefore, that we have are ones that have improved the well-being of people and their economic development. However, this has all come at a cost for the environment. It has been extensive, it has been largely irreversible, and it has led to our environment being degraded. So for me, while it also bears true that it is these humans that are causing a problem or environmental degradation that we see today, it is also for me true that the informal economy, especially the street trading sector, have not really benefited from this economic development that we speak so much about. But now while I wish not to argue for a continued human-induced distress to our environment, I do also seek to at least find a people-centered solution to what has been termed a people-centered problem. Solutions that would not even pin the environment that we have against humans or pin the street trading sector against local government. And why do I wish to do this? This is because the street traders are those people that have continued to suffer from the environmental degradation that we see, that arguably has been caused largely by big businesses around the world. This is why my argument today focuses on how we are protecting, or we need to protect, the constitutional environmental rights of the most vulnerable sector in our society, despite the anthropocenic approach that we speak about. I need to quickly give a background, or at least try and categorize this informal economy or the street trading sector in particular. If we speak of the informal economy, we're speaking here largely of economic activities that are taking place in an unregulated environment. This means that the sectors that are there are not regularly taxed under our business taxes, nor are the employees that are working there protected by the standard labor laws as we know this. But despite this, what we know is that even in the absence of common regulation, the informal economy remains an important sector, an important economy, especially for the urban poor, that cannot be absorbed by our formal economy. Our informal economy in South Africa then broadly now can be categorized under local economic development. And this is because in defining local economic development, we speak of a process through which local government, our local communities, and our community-based organizations are able to stimulate and maintain business activities that are able to create employment. The process itself of local economic development involves the building on existing resources of our local areas and accentuating the human, the capital, and institutional resources that we have. So the process typically of local economic development seeks to unify local communities, the private sector, our local government, and our NGOs, requiring them really to forge a relationship towards shaping and preserving at least the economic future of the people that exist within a territory. What we do know is that although not expressly stated in the Constitution, our local economic development in South Africa is a constitutional mandate of our local government. It is not a voluntary process that government can choose to opt in or out of. It can be found in our constitution, or at least it is implied in many of the objects of our government, including the need to promote economic and social development, as well as to encourage the involvement of local communities in matters of our local government. So now that we know that the street trading sector itself forms part of an essential mandate of our local government, then I need to at least give a sketch or give a picture of what we know to be the informal or street trading sector in South Africa. Generally or broadly, at least throughout the world, we know the informal economy, or rather the street trading sector, to be the biggest sector of the informal economy. In South Africa specifically, if you read the National Development Plan, it states that jobs that can be created by this sector alone are between 1.2 to 2 million jobs by the year 2030. In my study, I focused particularly on two cities, which is the city of Johannesburg and eThekwini. And the reason I did this is because this is where you see the most vibrancy of the street trading sector. It is very much visible and very much colorful. In Johannesburg, what you'll find, for instance, is a large and a favorite trade, which is called the second-hand clothing, colloquially known to Zulu-speaking people as the emadunusa. So there's numerous stalls that you'll find and tables of these second-hand clothes that are being sold in several corners of the city. Like myself, I walk those streets sometimes, the Viljoen, Wanderers, Small, Preachers. You'll find clothing there that range from 10 Rand to 150 Rand an item. Now, what the history of them is that it would usually be older women that could not afford to clothe their children that would use this trade. But what we are seeing today is that the trade itself enjoys patronage from a teeming range of customers, including now mainly young people who wish to just have a unique style of clothing that cannot really be replicated by our large retail clothing stores. Another favorite of that place and a favorite of mine is a lunchtime cow or sheep head that we call iskopo. And this is what you'd find typically in the numerous stores that are within our taxi ranks, particularly if you think of pre-taxi rank in Johannesburg. Their target market often is with the people that are taxi drivers, queue marshals, and people that are working within and around the taxi rank. If you're a person from Durban, then you would know that there is the Warwick Junction, or what they often typically call the Warwick Triangle. And it's located just on the border of the Durban city center. There again, you will find between 5,000 to 8,000 in street traders or informal traders whose economic activities include beading, it includes the serving of traditional cuisines and the selling of arts and crafts in those areas. Why do I look particularly at these vulnerable people in our society? Is that if you look at the images that I'm showing you behind, you can see that some street traders have trading stores that are really not equipped for any kind of weather or any environmental harm that can come about. Some do not even have a trading store at all. What you do not see here is how other street traders are trading from dilapidated buildings, and such places are often exposing our street traders from many environmental health risks. They include rain, hail, and storm, and often in dilapidated buildings, there's a lack of facilities, those that have been spoken about today in the last three presentations, and that is access to potable clean water, access to toilets, access to fire safety equipment, all of which has a direct bearing on the health, the safety, and the well-being of a street trader in South Africa. Now I need to focus on the right as it stands in the Constitution. Section 24 of our Constitution tells us that everybody has a right to an environment that is not harmful to their well-being. It further states that the government is then obligated to ensure that they protect the environment for current and future generations. I view Section 24 as being twofold. The first part for me is anthropocentric. Again, it goes back to the human being in that it seeks to protect the humans, by providing a healthy and safe environment for them. And the second one for me speaks to protecting the environment for the environment's sake. And this is the biocentric approach. Often when we are speaking of the anthropocenic approach, we speak about the damages that have been caused by man himself to the environment, almost arguably trying to pin the environment against people. Rarely do we return to the basic foundation that the environment is for the people, especially the vulnerable. This anthropocenic approach that I speak of is especially expressed in Section 24B of the Constitution, and it states that local government ought to do more than to promote a healthy and safe environment. Local government is compelled by its legislation to meet the standards that have been set by Section 24 of the Constitution, using its administrative and financial resources to do this. This means that our municipalities must take active steps towards fulfilling the right of the street traders, all of which for me is a right for a street trader to operate from a place that will not subject them to pollution and environmental harm. I'm really wary of time, and this is why I need to conclude and state that truly and honestly speaking, it remains a fact that the men, or at least humans, are the cause of the environmental degradation that we see today. However, our Constitution is also one that can be celebrated for its sympathy, at least, towards the vulnerable. And we cannot speak of sound constitutional engineering, nor can we celebrate 25 years of the right to an environment if we cannot see the theory that we have in this text translate to practicability, especially in mitigating or harmonizing relationships and ensuring the provision of a constitutional environmental right for street traders and all vulnerable sector of our society. And this is where I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nhlanhla. We enjoyed your presentation. And ladies and gentlemen, now the floor is open for questions and answers. And perhaps while you're thinking about your first question, I'm going to refer to the chat box. I see that Sue George posed a question to Adelaide with regard to the mismanagement or the poor management of sanitation. And she asks you, how do you believe that we can overcome the planning problem when it comes to sanitation? Adelaide, what are your thoughts on that?
Hi, Sue, thank you for the question. I think to overcome the planning problem around sort of cities and sanitation, I think what needs to happen is a significant shift in mindset. A lot of planning is still centered around the idea that sanitation is about connection to sewerage and simply just building bigger, better buildings to just take up space and, you know, create room for these infrastructures. But I really think a shift in mindset is what would help to bridge these gaps in our planning, because you are right, we do need the open spaces that are set aside, and we also need to protect our wetlands. So a significant shift from water-based sanitation is necessary because there are dry systems that offer an equivalent service. And in core urban areas, sort of like, you know, Pretoria or Johannesburg and Cape Town, it might be difficult to complete a shift away from water-based sanitation. But as the infrastructure is being updated or maintained, it's possible to gradually shift from a decentralized sewage system, which by the definition of it uses much less water, it's low water flows, and also requires smaller sewage treatment plants. So I think we can extend services whilst not necessarily extending the size of the infrastructure we need or maintaining the same sort of systems. It really is just about having some more flexibility in thought, which also involves a massive education drive to the general public, because people do have this conception that good sanitation is about water, is about the flushing, whereas it's not necessarily that. And if we shift this mindset in our planning, in our governance, as well as with our public, we can then also view waste as a resource in itself, using composting toilets or urine diversion toilets leaves room for us to use the dried compostable fecal matter as fertilizer in our crops in agriculture. So I think there is an untapped sort of well of knowledge around that just needs to be accessed with a change in thought processes around sanitation. I hope that helps with the answer.
He does. Thank you so much. I see Sue is quite active with regard to the questions. Sue, may I ask you to please pose your question for Nhlanhla? Sue, are you there? Okay, if not, Nhlanhla, obviously she thanks you for your nice presentation. She asked, do you believe that within the informal trading sector, particularly street traders, there should be no assignment areas, no structure, no rules or laws? And she says then surely if we are required to provide sanitation, water, roofs, etc., cover from the rain and elements, etc., that becomes a form of a shopping sector. Is it possible to achieve these things without some economies of scale? What are your thoughts there?
Thank you very much for the question. It's certainly true that we cannot, or at least the way I understand this question, we cannot continue without having laws. We need to have some form of regulation that happens. But what is important is an understanding that often when we are going to make laws, we need not make uniformed or even try and take a blanket approach to how we make laws. Today, I just speak of the informal economy, or at least the street trading sector itself. But there are several other sectors that would exist in the informal economy that still need our local government to understand the nuances between all of them before we can then just jump and say, we are going to create laws. I can tell you that conducting the study for 2 years as part of my LLM dissertation, what I found was that the laws that do exist, because they are laws, as much as the sectors themselves are not strictly regulated, but they are laws that are in place, but they seem to take a uniform approach and not understanding the nuances that we find in the street trading sector. What Sue speaks of, for instance, one can find when you speak of the neighbor goods market in Johannesburg, but it's not every street trader that can be housed there. Some street traders are foot peddlers. They thrive on human traffic. Some traders really cannot be boxed with the rest because of perhaps the products that they are providing. So it's in understanding them before we can jump to say these are the laws that we need. However, I do find that if we start with the Constitution and understanding the rights that they have, it will be much easier for us to come up with harmonizing laws as opposed to what we have now. If you will allow me, please, Chair, may I kindly address Dr. Murcott, who also then asked if it is not worth me trying to link the informal trading right to the cultural practices right. I must then say to her that the presentation that I give today merely just looked at one right because of the focus and the time limit that I have. But I certainly do that, and I look at various other rights of street traders as they are in the Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you for your comprehensive answer there, Nhlanhla. Maricel, may I ask you to please pose your question to Adelaide?
Surely. Hi, Adelaide. Thank you for the interesting and thought-provoking presentation. My question is just how attainable do you think such dry systems that you proposed are, especially in rural communities where municipalities do not necessarily have the capacity, financial or otherwise, to provide, fund or implement such infrastructure? And would the urban poor be beneficiaries of such systems? Or do you think that perhaps these systems could become part of a niche, expensive market to which the urban poor are not necessarily included? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. It's actually very interesting. Let me just gather my thoughts. I think the dry systems are actually quite accessible, I think, in rural communities rather than in urban areas, because urban areas already have an existing infrastructure. So I think it would be even more economically, it's unviable economically to sort of move everyone in urban areas who's used to a particular sort of system to these dry systems. Whereas in rural areas, according to the existing sanitation policies, it is actually advised that they rely more on dry systems, and that in implementing the type of technology, because these dry systems exist in different categories, where you have perhaps the lowliest ones, which would be perhaps the very basic VIP toilet, moving on to sort of double pits or pits with large composting holes, sorry for lack of a better term. So where these local municipalities do not necessarily have the capacity to provide a fund, I think there's room for them to rely on the next level in governance, provincial and national support to implement these systems, because although they are responsible for provision of the actual service, the national government and the provincial government are responsible for the universal access to sanitation. And within the national budgets, if you look quite closely, there's quite a lot of money that is allocated for sanitation. The issues come in where there just is really very little creativity in thinking about how we can sustainably provide these services. So in urban areas, you would find that, or at least for the urban poor, you would find that instead of being given sustainable toilets, even in informal settlements, you'd find that new chemical toilets will be put up. They'll take away the old ones, put the new ones, or just put new ones next to existing old ones, which are already full. And chemical toilets are perhaps the most unsustainable toilet out there, other than the traditional flush, because of the chemicals they need. And then in rural areas, there's this fixation on just providing a toilet, which looks like the traditional toilet, rather than thinking creatively about educating people that, okay, perhaps you can't have this toilet because of where you are, but perhaps use this one. And because in rural areas, there is a reliance on subsistence farming or some sort of agriculture. Once you do this and you use this toilet, you manage the waste this way, then you can use this as compost and so on and so forth. So I think there is a risk that it could become part of an expensive niche market, only because of the lack of clear guidance on how to implement these programs in South Africa. Because the problem isn't that we don't have the ideas, the problem is that the people implementing the ideas fixate on one aspect of it and then fail to follow through sustainably and creatively. Because sanitation requires flexibility, because it's simultaneously a public issue, but also an intensely private thing. So you require a level of cooperation between departments as well as the public that makes these things feasible. So I think in rural areas, more than urban areas, there is definitely massive capacity to implement these dry systems rather than in urban areas. And the urban poor, until they are fully incorporated in the planning of our cities, will, unfortunately, I think, continue to be relegated to the side. Even within the upgrading of informal settlements plan, there's a community that just kind of has been waiting for toilets. They were told they could have toilets and they're waiting for approval. And so they languish in limbo where they know they're supposed to get them, but they don't. And in the meantime, the municipality keeps providing them with chemical toilets, which is far more expensive than perhaps just building a normal toilet. I hope that answers the question to a certain extent.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions to our presenters? You're welcome to raise your hand at this stage. I see there's a new chat that came in from Professor Kidd. Perhaps, Michael, you can pose your question.
Okay, so you want me to do it verbally. So I'll just read what I've written here. It's for Melandri. Given that many of the water challenges and problems facing water management within cities could conceivably come from water management issues in other cities, is this something that you look at in your study? And if so, how is this best addressed? So for example, much of the water in eThekwini contains, I say, hopefully treated effluent that comes from Pietermaritzburg or Umzinduzi. Obviously, the former municipality has no management or governance jurisdiction or authority over the latter.
I'll answer the question. Thank you very much, Prof. Kidd. Thank you also for the comments in the chat box on the presentation, everyone. Prof. Kidd, you raised a very interesting question, and it's something that I haven't specifically considered up until now. And I think this actually enhances the idea of when we look at water security from an integrated perspective. Because in so far, I've only looked at the specific issues in the municipalities that I've identified, but not necessarily the overlapping impacts, that may arise from other municipalities or other geographical boundaries or areas. And it's something that I think goes back to the concept or the understanding of governance and the different approaches that have been identified in governance. I didn't really get into that. And this whole idea, I think, of multi-level governance or polycentric governance, which really calls on all actors to have an integrated approach or to have a transversal approach to addressing water-related issues. And this specifically refers to, I think, how the City of Cape Town has addressed many of its water-related issues, how even the Drakenstein municipality, not being a metro, but having these engagements with different municipalities and having those outreaches where these issues are discussed. And I think it also helps to have not just a bottom-up approach, but to also have that top-down and that intersecting approach. So it's not something that I've specifically considered in my research, but I think it really adds to the question of how are we integrating the issues that we are currently facing in cities. And I know that does not maybe answer the question, but I think it's perhaps the first step in addressing the problems that we face in the cities. Thank you, Prof.
Thanks, Melandri. Adelaide, I see you have a hand up. You're welcome.
Yes, thank you. My question is for Nonhlanhla. I just wanted to ask, in terms of providing services to traders, do you envision a system that works perhaps like in Japan where they have trading streets or kind of like small street, and then that exists as the shopping area, I guess a shopping center, so to speak, and then the services are provided almost like public services where there are toilets that exist for people to use, there is shelter there specifically, and then that covers them? Or do you envision that there should be certain areas in the city throughout that are designated for them to set up, and then this is where they should be, and then they receive services there as part of sort of the broader municipal plan?
Thank you, Adelaide, for the question. Unfortunately, what I envisaged myself might not be what the street traders themselves envisage, in the sense that I sit here as a scholar and not necessarily as an informal trader myself. If we are to sit with the traders, or at least if our government was to be able to create a platform where street traders are able to come to the government and say, listen, this is how things need to be done, it would be far much better, as opposed to scholars trying to answer a question or that the traders, or at least solve a problem that the traders themselves have not said, this is perhaps the solution that we have. So part of the, for instance, the mechanisms that you've just spoken about could both be used. It can be an either or, depending on what exactly do the street traders themselves need. I think that's where we need to start. What is it that they need? Are we speaking to them? Numerous cases that we've seen, for instance, when it comes to the altercation, not even an interaction because it hardly happens, but the altercation that often happens between local government and the street traders comes because of the fact that there's a lack of communication. So I myself might have an idea of what needs to happen, but it's the traders ultimately that will say, or it's every other member or participant of the informal economy that will be able to say, this is what we need. And until that happens, we can really truly then, on our side, just have the visions of what needs to happen.
Okay. Just to follow up, sorry, if there is some sort of consultation or a plan in place, how do you overcome reticence from informal traders, perhaps around moving to certain areas or perhaps changing the way that business is done? Because we do witness, reticence in the relocation of informal settlements in sort of the pursuit of spatial justice, where people refuse to move from particular areas, even if the offer is perhaps to move somewhere where they do have housing. They would rather remain where they are and have that service right there. How do you think perhaps we can navigate the nuances of people's relationships to perhaps location or land in a broad term?
And essentially for me, again, it's in communication. Because, for instance, if I can refer you to a case of the South African Informal Traders Association versus the city of Johannesburg, there what we saw was that the city, in trying to, for lack of a better word, they really were trying to beautify the city by completely removing street traders from the streets, stating that they are causing a nuisance and they are causing chaos within the city itself. And what they often then do is they try to push them into what they call business hubs, places that have, for instance, indicated like your neighbor goods market and such. So the problem really is, you're right, often there is that solution that one would say where local government says, we'll try and put you guys in one area, that's where you need to stay. But like I stated, because of the nuances that we have, for instance, because of how traders operate in different ways, then we really need to sit and really narrow it down, spot it down to what exactly is it that they need. You might find, for instance, where people are being moved, even in informal settlements, often there are things or services that are not being provided in those places that they need. We're speaking of people here that thrive on foot or on foot traffic. We're speaking on people that need to interact with people for them to make a living. When you're going to move them to places that are far from the people, or places where the people that are their own customers now need to take transport to get to them, it then becomes a problem.
All right, thank you so much.
Interesting indeed. Thank you, Nosanda. Any other questions? Perhaps one last question before we have to end this call. I see Maricel has a question for Meeschka. Maricel, will you please pose your question? I can also read it, but perhaps it's better if you read it yourself.
Sure, that's not a problem. Meeschka, well done on a very well presented study. I think it's so topical, and I just wanted to find out, are you only looking at metropolitan municipalities, or do you consider other municipalities such as district or local or secondary cities as well? My thoughts are just that perhaps metropolitan municipalities are better equipped to address or implement disaster risk management, but what about the others? Are they being left behind? Do you think that metropolitan municipalities can perhaps lead the way and assist the smaller municipalities in addressing or in implementing disaster risk management?
Thank you, Maricel, for your interesting question. So in my research right now only focuses on metropolitan municipalities. If you look at the Disaster Management Act and the Local Government Municipal Systems Act, we know that a disaster risk management is mainly a local government, it's mainly a metropolitan and district municipality function. So within this, when we look at the metropolitan municipalities, maybe it's something that local municipalities can implement or imitate at their level. And then also the disaster risk management at local government level, so specific local category C municipalities, only takes place when there is a institutional agreement between them. So once this agreement is in place, then we can maybe consider expanding my research to those types of municipalities. Thank you.
Thanks, Meeschka. I think that wraps up our session for this morning. I've got one more favor to ask though. Is it possible for everybody to please quickly put on your cameras so that we can take a nice screenshot of all the participants in this session? Please do that for us. Oh, it looks beautiful from our side. Control. Thank you, everybody. Now we are looking forward to our next session at 4 o'clock. Hoping to see you there. Enjoy your lunch. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.